Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Attention Please podcast, now on video. If you like the podcast, kindly like, share, subscribe. You know what to do. So, today, what I'm going to talk about is a topic that I've wanted to talk about for some time, but I haven't quite gotten around to talking about it. And that's basically because my novel, Mahabharat Murders, as you would know, because I've been talking about it, is going to be released as a web series next week. So, I've been busy with some of the promotional activities. I did a few podcasts around that. But today I'm going to return to regular programming, and we'll be talking about Elon Musk and his acquisition of Twitter. This, as all of you know, has led to an absolute liberal meltdown. I was watching some YouTube clips of a program called The View, which is a fairly influential show on daytime television in the US, which is the panel is most absolutely progressive. They usually have one token conservative there, and the panelists on View who all of them are women. All of them, that's really the thing about View, is that they just went off on Elon Musk, and they went off on Tesla. Actually, all of them own Tesla, by the way, and what a crappy car it was. It was quite funny actually watching them suddenly realizing what a crappy car they have as a Tesla, given despite the fact that it's lowers their greenhouse emissions and possibly does more for the progressive agenda than most of the products that they endorse. But it doesn't matter now that Elon Musk has acquired Twitter. Apparently, it's seen as kind of a blowback, just as Trump's candidacy was. That this is a blowback, and just means that hate speech and misinformation will make its return on Twitter. Blah blah whatever. This podcast is not really about that, but more about the argument that's often used, which is that, there's no notion of freedom of speech on Twitter. Twitter is a private company and it can do whatever they want. There is no freedom of speech. So when you use the word freedom of speech, you're actually using it in the wrong context. And this is absolutely true. I have actually used this argument myself, and it is true that freedom of speech is a contract that the citizen has with their government. There's nothing called a freedom of speech with a private company or with an individual. So for instance, when you work in a company, there's no notion of freedom of speech. You cannot take the company's secrets and just publish them online and say freedom of speech. You can't, right? Because freedom of speech is something which is between you and the state. It's not between you and any other private entity. So short answer, yes, the Twitter can basically do whatever they want. If you don't like Twitter, just go somewhere else. I mean, that's really what people say. That's really what progressives started saying once they got hold of Twitter. That if you don't like Twitter, make your own Twitter. And people just couldn't, right? Because of the network effects. So this essentially that meant, and we're coming to that kind of changes the very equation of what freedom of speech is. So let's take a step back and look at what really freedom of speech is. So the notion of freedom of speech is a fairly recent thing. If you spoke against the king, I mean, the king could basically ask for your head to be cut off. That used to be the case till about, let's say, 200, 300 years ago, everywhere in the world. You could still find this in North Korea, by the way. So it's not that it's totally gone. If you did not follow the religion of the king, then that also would be a problem. And you would find this again in many countries in the world where there's a state religion. So the fact is that the king could impose his religion. The king could basically prevent you from saying anything against the government or anything that might cause him to be embarrassed. So freedom of speech basically came into being as an instrument of having democracy. That there is no real democracy without freedom of speech. Because the freedom of speech exists between an individual and the state, and the real reason is because of the power differential. That's why it doesn't exist between you and a company. Because you can go and shift companies if you want, but you cannot go and shift states. You just cannot. There's no obligation for another state to accept you. So you cannot move. That's the thing. It's a kind of a monopolistic relation between you and the state. Once you're born into it, it's very difficult for you to get out of that state. So the power differential also exists, of course, and that's fairly obvious. So the state can use its own apparatus to make the process the punishment. And we see this in India all the time because we don't have true freedom of speech here. If you forward a cartoon of a politician, they can basically get the case running for 10, 12 years. And that's exactly what's happened in Bengal for the cartoon. So it's not that anything's going to happen to the guy. It's not, I don't think he served serious jail time or anything, but he'll just have to come up, show up in court, get adjournments, they will not show up. So it's basically making the process the punishment. And this happens all the time, right? So the freedom of speech, and I'm not saying that India has true freedom of speech, but America possibly has something closest to freedom of speech in terms of the First Amendment, is that it defines, when there's a power differential, it defines that what your specific rights are and what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say. So it lays out. Every state does that. The US Constitution gives the citizen much more rights than what the Indian Constitution does. And I'm not getting into the reasons as to why that's the case, but that has always been the case. The Indian Constitution absolutely limits the context in which a citizen has freedom of speech. The American protection in the American Constitution is much more pervasive. But again, the principal thing to remember is that freedom of speech exists when there is an extreme high power differential and where you cannot, quote unquote, take your business elsewhere. So what I argue is that, and this is not just an argument that I've made, many people have made this argument, but I agree with this argument, is that in today's world, some companies are essentially more powerful than the state. The Googles, Facebooks, Twitters of the world, both in terms of the revenue and both in terms of the influence and the fact that they are the only game in town. So just like you cannot go to another Twitter, just like you cannot go to another country, you just cannot go to another Twitter. So the rights, I would argue, and many have argued, that provide the citizen the right to transparency between itself and the state should extend to social media companies. Let's call them social media companies. Google, it's not technically a social media company, but bear with me for a while. So social media companies, that there should be that kind of a framework between a contract between the individual. There's also a notion of data privacy. Not going to talk about it in this podcast, but that's also there because that's really their business model. So what exactly are you providing them? What exactly are they providing you? And so to make that contract between these super states and you more explicit, and that, many say, is the cornerstone of democracy in this age. It's not just a relation between you and the state. As a matter of fact, these entities are in many cases and in many places more powerful than the state. Because let's say you are a person who uses Twitter to do your business. You're a person who uses Twitter because you like doing it. This is the only way you can get your opinions out. You can talk to your government officials. You can talk to customer service. And if they ban your account, they basically stifle your voice. There's nothing you can do at that point of time. There is no other Twitter to go to. There is no other Facebook to go to. And this is not their fault. As a matter of fact, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing that they have done, they're evil. No, it's their business. And these companies are extremely successful. I mean, Facebook wasn't the first social media company. There were many more before that. Google tried Google Plus, they couldn't succeed. So, kudos to them for being able to have a product which has kind of survived the ravages of time in this day and age. But that doesn't mean that they can basically do whatever they want. I mean, that's really the question. This is really where I believe that at least the theoretical idea of Elon Musk taking over Twitter is so good. I don't know exactly what he's going to do. Again, I don't think Musk is a very trustworthy person. So I don't know what he's planning to do, and what he says is because he said things which he hasn't done. Like he said, if you give me the bill for world hunger, I'll solve it, which they gave him the bill and he didn't. So trust me, I'm not an Elon Musk fan, but if I'm going to go by what Elon Musk is saying and what he's going to bring to the table, I'm very hopeful of that. And I think this is what's needed. Well, let's just look at, Twitter. So Twitter is not just like the government. It is extremely powerful. It can make the process, the punishment of repeatedly banning you and then you trying to show why you shouldn't be banned. It can do all of that. But and this is exactly where progressive wokeism has created so many problems, is that before, like 10 years ago, most companies had one single agenda, which is to make money. which was purely understandable. But now companies are treated like human beings and they have a definite political ideology and they're very upfront about it. So when you have a super powerful body with the power to cause you harm, with a certain political ideology, and in case of progressive religion, actually a religion, there is no difference between it and the state. It is an oligarchy. That's what it is. So if they can make the process the punishment, if they have a definite political agenda, which they are perfectly fine with being upfront about. I mean, you have Jack standing with Smash the Brahminical Patriarchy. I mean, he's making a political statement. So of course, anybody who does not follow that politics needs protections there. They need protection from Twitter. And again, what kind of protection are we talking about here? You know, Twitter is not going to knock on my door and at 11 at night put a mask on my face and take me away. It's not going to do that. So what protections am I talking about? So let's look at what Twitter says. So Twitter, if you ask, the official stance of Twitter is that, you know, we don't punish any opinion. The only thing we regulate is hate speech and misinformation. Now, this is the second point, which is this misinformation has really become, because hate speech, in a way, Twitter has to, because even hate speech is illegal in all countries. But again, Twitter has to be able to defend in a court of law why they have taken down something as hate speech, whether it meets it's not Twitter's decision, but they have taken it down because it does not meet the definition, because it does meet the definition of hate speech in the country. So that is Twitter's responsibility. But let's look at the misinformation part, which I believe is where the real con job happens. So Twitter has taken this stance, and this thing happened after Trump got elected, where the pervasive narrative was that Trump got elected because Russia basically created a number of bots and convinced a large number of Americans to vote for Trump by spreading misinformation about Hillary Clinton and the DNC hacks and her emails, blah, blah, blah. You guys know that. So this is misinformation in itself, because there's very little data there is a lot of data to show that Russians did try, but there's very little data to show that Russians actually caused Trump to be elected. So there's this huge leap there, but let's leave that to the side for now. So the thing with misinformation is that Twitter doesn't regulate misinformation uniformly. That's the thing. So Indian politicians can, with impunity, said that EVMs have been hacked all the time and cast aspersions on the very essence of our democracy. But if a US politician does that, that politician is toast at this point of time. Twitter will fall down on that guy like a ton of bricks. Why not on Indian politicians? Today I saw a tweet from Disha Ravi, which was that the coal shortage in this country is fiction and it's being done to take away tribal lands. There is no data. As a matter of fact, I can show you number of reports. Again, you can always say, oh, they're all wrong, but there's a multiple number of studies that there is truly a coal shortage based on different things that have happened in COVID-19, the war in Ukraine. There is a coal shortage. So to have a tweet which says the coal shortage is fictional, that is misinformation, that is fake news. Twitter does nothing about it. Twitter, and this is fairly well known, took down the account of New York Post, which is kind of the flagship conservative media outlet of the US, traditional conservative media outlet, because of a piece they did on Hunter Biden. They tagged it as misinformation before the elections, and it was actually true. So Twitter's Jack later said that it was wrong, that they shouldn't have done it, that this was not something which, he stands behind. But the question is, well, how did it happen? He never says, how did that happen? It's not one person can't do this. So it's churlish to point to this one person, that person did it. No, when a decision like this is taken in any modern corporation, it is taken by committee, by a number of lawyers, by a number of different stakeholders sitting, analyzing, thinking of different situations. So this is not just one guy comes in on a bad mood, I was in a traffic and says, you know what, I'm going to ban New York Post right now. So it doesn't happen like that, especially not to something like New York Post or not to someone like Trump. It might happen to you and me, but it won't definitely not happen to them. So the reason that happened was simple, that somebody in Twitter with a definite political ideology, not somebody, let me repeat, but somebodies with a definite political ideology. And this happens because they always hire from people with the same political ideology, which leads to corporations having a political ideology, which is exactly why they are no different from governments, I would claim, is that they decided that, on one hand, Trump might get reelected. We might have a Hillary, reboot of that same situation. So let's just stop it. And, later on, if something happens, dekha jayega fir. That's basically what they did. So this is the problem. Now, don't get me wrong. You see, if I was running Twitter, I'm not. I wouldn't be sitting in this room if I was. But if I was running Twitter, I would tell you that it's impossible. I mean, it's impossible for Twitter or any platform, given the fire hose of content which is being produced every microsecond, to regulate it and to check for whether it's information and misinformation. Even the notion of what information, what truth is and not what truth is very, very vague and hazy. And you don't have to see Rashomon to know that. Because not much of what we know is truth, to be honest. I mean, what we read in history is not truth, by the way. It was either decided by some emperor or whoever won the war at that point of time, or it was decided by some guys in JNU who were writing the history books and who were making history books that were being as per the NCERT guidelines. So much of what we know is also not fully the truth, right? Only science really and mathematics is truth. It's objectively the truth. And we're fine with it. That's the main thing. I don't understand what this problem with fake news is. Ultimately, the thing is that the world has to go back to the way it used to be, which is let the consumer of the information decide if something is the truth or not. So if I read that tweet which says that the coal shortage is fictional, there are some people who will believe that no matter what. It's not that the tweet made them believe. It's not people who were like energy analysts who were poring over the figures suddenly say, oh, all the stuff I've been doing for so long was wrong. This person has said that coal shortage is fictional. Well, this is fictional then. See, this won't happen, right? So you are basically going to accept what you want to hear. That's exactly how misinformation, it's exactly how religion works also, by the way. So why try to regulate it? Why does Twitter even, I understand the hate speech part, but why does Twitter feel the need to clamp down on quote unquote misinformation? So if an Indian politician says that EVMs have been hacked, okay, let him say that. That's the freedom of speech part. Whether I choose to accept it or not is my problem. If I choose to accept it, then the joke's on me. If there are people in the US who still believe that the last elections were stolen, well, the joke's on them. Well, they're in any case going to believe that. It's not the wordings there that are making them believe or not believe. That's basically confirming their belief. So misinformation doesn't really change anyone's mind ever. People have just chosen to believe what they want to believe. It just validates that. That's what it happens. And again, if I prevent this, if let's say Twitter has this 100% correct algorithm, which magically just finds misinformation all the time. If I can't get it from Twitter, guess what? I'll get it from somewhere else because I will get something to validate. Even if I can't validate, I'll validate by myself. So the main thing about freedom of speech is you cannot and should not regulate this notion of whether this is misinformation or not, whether this is fake news or not, because ultimately you can't. You cannot do it technologically. You cannot do it uniformly. But however, if you choose to do so, and this is something which again Elon Musk has said, and I agree with him, is that the algorithms that tag things as misinformation or the kind of internal processes they have, that needs to be made public. We need to know what are the steps that they are following, because that's important. Because if there isn't, and I'm not sure there is, then what happens is it's essentially the political ideology of the people who are taking the decisions that decide what truth is and what truth isn't. And if something validates their version of the truth, that's truth then. And that is where you need something like the First Amendment. This is really why the First Amendment came into being, that the king cannot impose their religion on their subjects, and the king cannot stifle free speech of their subjects. This is no different from that. That's exactly what Twitter has become, because it has a definite political ideology. It is not transparent in how it takes its decisions. It is objectively not being fair. It is not being consistent. It is not being uniform. And that's why it's essential. Now, whether Elon Musk wants to do that or not, if he will actually be able to do it, I don't know. I'm actually skeptical. But the fact that he's taken over, and the fact that the old administration of Twitter has spectacularly failed, is, to me, absolutely, absolutely true. So I'm glad that he's taken over. I'm glad Elon Musk has taken over. But again, if you ask me, I'm not very hopeful that he will change anything. But if he does, good for him. So thanks a lot for listening to the podcast, and I'll be back soon. Bye-bye.